When you get a direct sequel to a game that's widely considered to be one of the best games of all time, sometimes it's not too out of the ordinary to get the impression that it could make this old thing irrelevant. I mean, when you have a game that basically reuses the previous game's engine, mechanics, hell, even world design, I probably wouldn't blame you for dropping the old thing in favor of the new. However, that doesn't automatically mean that just because a critically acclaimed game gets a direct sequel a few years later that's bigger and better means its predecessor is completely obsolete. Far from it. A good amount of games that got direct sequels, or at least a good majority of the ones I've seen, don't completely overshadow their predecessors entirely, or get fans of the original games to abandon them altogether if they're currently playing the sequel, and that could be for many different reasons. Like how the original game is still the one to do it all first and feels a bit more special for that very reason. Or it could possibly be for the impact it left on the gaming industry. Or you might find that there are some aspects or ideas the original does better than its successor. And there's definitely more reasons than that, no doubt about it, but I won't be going through all that today. Because I already did. But rest assured that just because a game gets a direct sequel doesn't automatically mean its predecessor is left alone to die. These games might have certain elements or aspects added to them that may or may not be better than the previous game, that really depends on your opinion. But you know for a fact that this new game will never fully replace the last game, or the game before that, and more so coexist with it instead. And that's kinda how I prefer things to be. So get a load of this. The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is an official follow-up to the open-world masterpiece Breath of the Wild. And unlike other Zelda game follow-ups like Wind Waker to Twilight Princess, where those games aren't necessarily picking up where the last game left off, that's exactly what Tears of the Kingdom does. A game meant to continue where the last game left off. And it is awesome because of that. However, with something that I was pleasantly surprised by at first, Tears of the Kingdom somehow reuses the same world as Breath of the Wild, but just expands upon it by having some floating landmasses in the sky and the underground depths. And while the execution of these additions left a lot to be desired, the same world that was brought back from Breath of the Wild is still a pleasure to explore. It's like a rock. I couldn't find a rock outside, I had to settle for toilet paper. And with the new abilities that you have, you might assume that this adventure is truly something that makes the original obsolete. So let's talk about it. Now, after Tears of the Kingdom's release, I essentially just felt like it's the replacement for Breath of the Wild, as again, it takes everything that game did, but just expands upon it with more and more stuff, leading me to realize, okay, so this game has everything this other game has, why would I go back to the last one? And while my thoughts on that haven't changed completely, I have come around to see how Breath of the Wild is still its own beast in a post-sequel world. It completely reinvented not just the Zelda series, but the open world genre entirely when it launched on March 3rd, 2017 for Wii U and Switch. Guess which one I played? And it was my first true experience with an open world game. I mean, I would eventually go on to play games like Super Mario 64, which gives the players more freedom with its 3D non-linear level design, but really, calling something like that an open world is kind of a stretch, hate to say it. And even so, it was more of a platformer anyways. Breath of the Wild was different though. This wasn't a platformer, but a full-on adventure game featuring a massive world for you to explore, as well as do whatever the hell you want. I don't care, there's no limits. So for being my first true experience with an open world game, Breath of the Wild very much did everything I wanted a game like this to do, and it is a fantastic adventure as a result. But I still have to answer the burning question I set myself up to answer. Does Breath of the Wild still have the same worth now that we have a new game that's a direct follow-up that has pretty much everything the prior game has and more? Guess we'll have to find out when I return to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. So upon booting up the game, it definitely feels weird with how the Sky Islands are nowhere to be found, as well as the depths. But hey, I put up with that for 6 whole years, so I'm sure I'll adjust to it in due time. And after moving around again with the Wii U gamepad and seeing all these familiar locations before they've seen some kind of significant change in Tears of the Kingdom, it brings me right back to when I was 13 years old when I first played it. Although, the idea of not being able to build your own machinery with the Ultra Hand and fusing weapons together with other weapons you have in your inventory is something you kinda can't readjust to. Not a fault at Breath of the Wild or anything, it's just that if you put a good chunk of time into Tears of the Kingdom, it's kinda hard to go back to something not that. But let's just look past that and see everything this game has to offer. Like The Great Plateau, the game's tutorial section and arguably one of the best in all of gaming, even being better than Tears of the Kingdom's Great Sky Islands. This is the 1-1 from Super Mario Bros. For a Zelda game. After starting up the game, you're put into this landmass that could very much pass for an entire game on its own if they really wanted to. Probably not worth $70, but hey, what even is $70 these days? There is quite a bit to do here for this just being a basic little starting area, and you will need to complete a few story-based missions, including cutscenes and dialogue, before you're given access to the rest of the world. But what I really love about this is how you can just freely run around the plateau learning everything the game asks of you without doing any story missions. And it pretty much excels at that. It teaches you about the dangers of being underdressed in colder climates. It shows you how stamina works in both swimming and climbing. It also shows you how you can pick up almost any item you see and use it as a weapon. That is what a good tutorial section should do. This is easily one of my favorite tutorial sections in any game by far. The Great Sky Islands from Tears of the Kingdom, on the other hand, is fine, but it's just so much smaller in comparison with slightly less to do. Plus, it feels less memorable as a result. Ugh, finally! Bullshit! And, on top of the somewhat lacking tutorial section, you kinda have to sit through a decently length intro filled with dialogue before you really get into it. Now, to be perfectly honest, I actually really loved the intro with how dark it was and the tension it brought after the revival of the Demon King. But it sorta made the Great Sky Islands not as memorable or frankly as fun. Still good though, not to hate on Tears of the Kingdom or anything like that. I just think that when comparing the two side by side, Breath of the Wild does win when it comes to teaching you about the game's mechanics and overall world design. But in Tears of the Kingdom's defense, most people who's played Breath of the Wild were already going to play Tears of the Kingdom and were probably already familiar with a good chunk of the game's returning mechanics. So I think that could be a factor as to why the tutorial this time around wasn't as intricate as the last game. But once you've completed everything that needs to be completed to unlock the rest of the world on the Great Plateau, that's where the game truly begins. Just casually exploring the overworld and fighting the hordes of monsters that you come across, it's great stuff. Now, fun fact, well, maybe not that fun, but a fact regardless. A good chunk of the enjoyment I got out of Breath of the Wild was not by completing the story missions or side quests or all that garbage, it was just with creating my own adventure out of the game's massive world. Challenging myself to get from place to place without using the teleportation feature that you have with the Sheikah slate, and fighting whatever stands in your way never got old to an open world novice like me. And all the places in the distance I always saw weren't just set pieces, you can actually go to them and explore to your heart's content. There's literally no limit to where you can go, and the paraglider you're given at the end of the tutorial makes exploring or gliding through the sky in this case that much more enjoyable. Another key part of the fun I found with the game's world was with the combat. I found encountering monsters, especially ones that put up quite a fight like the Guardians and Lynels, made for such a fun time to the point where I would purposely try to seek out monsters just to fight them because of how much fun the combat ended up being for me. Now, there definitely were points where it became more frustrating than fun, where I kept losing to a specific enemy a number of times, but those moments were few and far between, and I still found the combat to be quite fun overall. And I always forget how with the Sheikah towers, you have to manually climb them in order to activate them on your map, which isn't what you have to do with the Sky View towers in the sequel, as it's more so a puzzle you have to solve instead. And climbing terrain in Breath of the Wild as well as Tears of the Kingdom is still a slow and rather monotonous process, especially when it's raining. Yeah, be as realistic as you want, it doesn't save climbing for me. But hey, even if climbing isn't much fun, mountains and cliffs are no longer obstacles that hinder your progression and are more so part of the level design that you could use to progress unlike previous games. And that's a huge addition right there. What's also pretty huge is how you can upgrade both your health meter and stamina anytime by collecting 4 spirit orbs from the game's various shrines, which are basically mini dungeons that are spread throughout the game, and will allow you to exchange them for either more stamina or more health. And that's really cool how you're now given that option and not restricted with one or the other. And going back to the world for a second, there's another thing here that's pretty interesting, and that's with your resistance to weather conditions. If you're in, let's say, Goron City and it's blazing hot, you'll take damage as you're vulnerable to the heat unless you drink a heat-resistant elixir or equip a set of armor that's resistant to the heat. Or if you're in the middle of a blizzard and you don't have anything to protect yourself from the cold like proper clothing or even a torch, you'll take damage, much like with the heat. And it's that element of realism that I do really admire about these games. I mean, yeah, sometimes it could get kind of annoying when you're focused on a story objective and you can't progress because you don't have the proper necessities to survive the harsh conditions, but it gives the world a sense of realism that makes it feel more alive and has you focus more on survival rather than the actual objective you were focused on half the time. And speaking of realism, we can't forget about everybody's favorite, weapon durability. Everybody's favorite. So people really don't like the weapon durability that this duology of games introduces, and I'm one of them. I mean, I do like how it adds to the realism here, and I get why they brought it back in Tears of the Kingdom, much like the weather resistance I mentioned earlier, but man, I have had so many instances where I was going into a fight with a weapon I just found that seemed to have a decent amount of durability behind it, only for it to break right in the middle, leaving me completely defenseless. And I mean, yeah, that does force you to get more creative with what you can use at your disposal if you're low on weapons, but still. So while it definitely plays an important part of the game's survival aspect and can lead to some creative strategies, it's still pretty annoying for the most part. And speaking of survival, Breath of the Wild even features cooking now as a way to regain your health or to improve stats. It's nice that even Zelda's trying new hobbies. And cooking, in my opinion, is probably one of the best new features that this game has because it becomes very useful if you're fighting a strong enemy and you're low on health, so you can head on into your inventory, eat something, and you'll be back at full HP. And something like that is especially useful during boss fights too. Even the elixirs that temporarily improve your stats are also incredibly useful too. Now, moving off of the survival aspect of the game, I just want to take a moment to mention how crazy it is seeing important landmasses in this game's world, where in Tears of the Kingdom, they're completely absent, like the 4 divine beasts for example. These were story-based missions where each of the 4 were corrupted and you have to go inside, solve some puzzles, fight the Blight Ganon that resides within it, and free the spirit of the imprisoned champions at the end of each. Now, because this was all done over 6 years ago, I unfortunately don't have footage of any of this, so you'll just have to take my word for it. Like how I'm supposed to take everybody's word at the fact that Chili's is supposed to be the best restaurant. Now, story-wise, Breath of the Wild is pretty interesting in a lot of ways because you don't actually witness these major events firsthand like in the previous games, but instead, you're watching what went on with these events in the past, meaning you're just watching what's going on rather than actually playing through it. That's also the case with the follow-up too, and it is kind of disappointing, but hey, I still had a ton of fun exploring the world, matching my surroundings with the picture on the Sheikah slate to see what went on 100 years ago. Although, Tears of the Kingdom was a lot more lame with how it did the story in my opinion, thanks to a cast of characters that sadly weren't anywhere near as interesting as Breath of the Wild, and overly repetitive story cutscenes that introduces nothing new each time you watch them. Say what you want about Breath of the Wild and its story overall being a bit basic as well, but the cast of characters were way more interesting and the story's high moments were genuinely quite high. And I think what's also kind of interesting is that you're recalling memories that you witnessed before you lost consciousness for 100 years. And if you found one before the other that was supposed to connect in a way, it doesn't feel like a loss because these are, well, memories. So it makes a lot more sense when viewing them out of order when you think about it in that context. And it still amazes me how they made that work. But in Tears of the Kingdom, while there certainly were some highlights throughout regarding the story, they just weren't interesting enough to save the repetitive and I would even say disjointed portions that bogged it down in so many ways. I mean, sure, some things like finally having a memorable antagonist this time around and a few unexpected plot twists did help it to an extent, but other than those, this game's story isn't particularly great. Now, the story-based objectives for Breath of the Wild are usually pretty straightforward and will almost always tell you what it is you need to do. Free the 4 divine beasts across all the different regions of Hyrule, locate this person in this village, go to Korok Forest and obtain the Master Sword, destroy Calamity Ganon. It's not really like a clue per se, but think of it like how the star missions in Mario 64 were. And the same could also be said about the side quests too, but more on those in a bit. However, Breath of the Wild does something with its objectives that I think are really cool, which is how you could completely bypass all of them after completing the Great Plateau and going straight to the final boss. And you don't see very many games that have something like that, and quite frankly, I'm not the kind of person who would do it, but it's really cool how you're given that open sense of freedom here and not restricted behind all these objectives. It really adds to the limitless possibilities that this game is all about. But when you're not skipping objectives and 100%ing the story, however, you'll be meeting a handful of unique and memorable characters where many of them are straight up voice acted. And that's another new thing that Breath of the Wild introduced to the Zelda series. full voice acting. It gets a lot of hate and really only appears in major story moments, but hot take alert, I personally think it's actually implemented fairly well. I mean, obviously it's not perfect, but there weren't a whole lot of instances where it sounded like certain lines were only recorded in one take or anything like that. And when NPCs are not voiced, they're usually communicating with you via text. I always found it bizarre how not all the major characters throughout the game are fully voiced. Like, what's the point of getting voice actors in a recording studio if they're only gonna record like 60 minutes of dialogue, you know? And usually, it'll switch from regular voice acting to text, even for the more important characters, which I personally found to be inconsistent. But ultimately, I don't really have too much to add here other than the fact that the voice acting was executed in a solid way despite the game not taking full advantage of it. Now, as for the side quests, there's a whole lot of them that can be found throughout, but I personally didn't find myself to be all that invested in them as much as I wanted to be. I mean, I found a few that were interesting, but the rest I kind of just felt like I was just wasting my time and nothing more. So that's where I draw the line. Besides, I'm not really much of a side quest person in my video games, so that might be more of a reason. Or I could just hate fun. Now let's move on to the runes, which are the new abilities you are given to with the Sheikah slate. These made a comeback in Tears of the Kingdom, but they originally made their debut here in Breath of the Wild. There isn't very many, but each one is supposed to assist you with either solving a puzzle in or out of the game's shrines, or to help you get around the world. The main ones here are the remote bombs, which one is spherical and another is cubed. Magnesis lets you pick up metallic objects and do something stupid like drop them on enemies or something. Cryonis, which lets you create platforms out of ice on large bodies of water. And Stasis, which lets you temporarily freeze enemies or objects to deal some extra damage on them, or serve as a great way to get around. There's even a damn camera! Now this has to be the best game of all time. Although, while these are still very much cool to have and are fun to tinker with, I found half of them to pretty much be disposable. Like, why is there two kinds of bombs here when really you only need one? And with Stasis, I personally never really used it all that much, as the enemy or object frozen will only be frozen for like half a second and that's it. Well, actually it lasts a bit longer on stuff like boulders, but to me it feels like it could have easily been replaced with something with more worth to it and no harm would have been done. Not the camera though. This thing's great. Now, while we're at it, let's talk about the final boss. What else are videos about Breath of the Wild for, right? Now, the final boss here is actually not too bad. You venture into Hyrule Castle where you get a brief cutscene showing Calamity Ganon rising from the ceiling, ground crumbles beneath you, end up in battle arena, then the final showdown begins. However, if you've managed to free the 4 divine beasts earlier in the game, then a cutscene showing all 4 of the spirits of the champions unleashing a devastating attack that reduces Ganon's health bar by half plays. And I don't know, this comes off as a bit iffy to me for some reason. I mean, it's not bad. If anything, it gives you a reason to want to complete the story missions if it means it helps you out towards the final boss, but it sort of comes off as a way to end what would be an overly long and monotonous fight and make it shorter rather than something that would actually help you. It quite literally feels like it's just here to make the fight easier. Like, wouldn't it be cool if you could actually control the divine beasts and it almost becomes an arcade style shooter where you're shooting Ganon when he's flying around? Like, come on, that would be awesome. But as it is now, its addition is fine, but I personally think of it as a bit more of a missed opportunity. Or I could just be wrong, who knows. But the fight itself, on the other hand, it's good. There's 2 phases here. The first one is just a general fight against Ganon in a giant spider form in Hyrule Castle, similar to the other bosses in the game. Then the next phase takes place outside where you fight Dark Beast Ganon while riding a horse, and using the Bow of Light to aim at the targets that Princess Zelda tells you to aim at, which is kinda lame. Who knew? Did you know? I didn't. It's literally just a flashy target practice minigame with nothing interesting holding it together at all. If it was something that tested your arrow aiming abilities, like how the first phase of the final boss tests what you learned with your weapons and your abilities, that'd be better. But it doesn't, and it's just so boring. But you could go either way with that. And once the final boss is completed, we're treated to a cutscene of Zelda sealing away Ganon and a heartfelt monologue at the end by the princess, and ends with asking Link if he remembers her. Then, the credits. I gotta be honest, there was something genuinely emotional about this game's ending. I couldn't tell if it was the beautiful music that played throughout, or the fact that all the struggles the characters throughout the story faced finally paid off. 100 years later. It was just a very touching way to end off the story with Link and Zelda. Now after the credits, another cutscene plays where the spirits of the King of Hyrule and all the champions watches over Link and Zelda atop Hyrule Castle before disappearing for good. And this is yet another ending that tugs at the heartstrings. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Now, I know I didn't go through everything. I mean, come on, Breath of the Wild is a ginormous game. Of course I can't talk about every little detail here. But I think I went through a good chunk of the essentials that I believe are pretty much what makes Breath of the Wild, Breath of the Wild. And man, after jumping back in and re-experiencing one of my favorite games of all time was an amazing experience. This game is truly a masterpiece in every sense of the word. Exploring the overworld is fun. Fighting enemies is fun. Cooking and even completing the story is a great time. And for someone who got into the open world genre because of this game makes it all the better. Breath of the Wild is truly excellent despite some glaring aspects that can be pretty annoying, like weapon durability, the fact that with the story you're simply just watching what's going on rather than actually experiencing it yourself, and 2/5 of the runes that you have access to aren't all that useful at all. Breath of the Wild is not a perfect game by any means. I mean, no game is, but it's pretty damn close. However, that begs the question regarding whether this game still has some worth to it now that we live in a post-Tears of the Kingdom world. So, do you still have a reason to play Breath of the Wild? Well, that depends. Do I like having opinions that are bad, or opinions that are ass? Now, keep in mind, this is just my opinion, so what I'm gonna say applies to me and me only. So please don't riot. This game is great, really, it is, but I'm still kind of in that mindset that I said at the start where when you have a direct sequel to that game that basically has everything the previous entry has and more, even if the new stuff is kind of worthless once you think about it, I kind of believe that you don't really have much of an incentive to go back and play it now. But that doesn't automatically mean that's the opinion I'm going with. I'm just saying, while a part of me says that it is still worth revisiting, another part is kind of just telling me that it isn't. So it's kind of a hard thing to say. I mean, the game's world felt off without the sky islands and the depths, and even the new abilities that you have are just too hard to let go of after you discover their possibilities. Dude, the internet's pissed. But even if it may or may not be hard to go back and play nowadays, that doesn't mean it doesn't do things that are better than in Tears of the Kingdom, because it does. A better tutorial, a better story, and a cast of characters that to me are far more unique, and just the distinct qualities that comes from Breath of the Wild being the first of its kind makes it feel far more special to me. But even aside from that, I think I would still have to go with Tears of the Kingdom just slightly due to how it builds upon the foundation of the past game with more stuff, even if that may or may not be as good as the last game. But don't take that as, oh, he's saying more is better, even if the execution wasn't particularly great. I'm just saying that because we have a game here that houses a whole ass world that was already huge in the last game, while adding on top of it with additions that can be cool despite me feeling underwhelmed by a lot of it, still offers more to do at the end of the day. And really just puts me in the mindset that Tears of the Kingdom is just a slightly better game in my opinion. I don't think it should replace Breath of the Wild, but rather expand upon it, like, you know, DLC. But regardless of which one you prefer, Breath of the Wild was also the game that left a bigger impact on the gaming industry. So many new elements that influenced countless other games with staples that would be a standard going forward. And with it being my first open world game, it felt like something completely fresh and new, and even changed my entire view on games. And that's something not even Tears of the Kingdom can do. So while I think Tears of the Kingdom is the better game overall because it has so much more, Breath of the Wild was the game that left a much bigger impact on the industry, and me too, which can't be denied. So there you have it. While I don't have a lot of interest in going back to Breath of the Wild nowadays, I still genuinely care about it, and will continue to do so no matter what. You could build a car?! Anyways, hi everybody, welcome to today's retrospective, where today we're going to be talking about garbage cans. What are they used for? That. And that's a wrap on today's video. If you enjoyed it, then please consider subscribing and checking out my other videos on my channel where you'll find more videos like this one. And with that, thank you all so much for watching, have an amazing rest of your day, and see you next time.